For example, and you and I have talked about this, Ms. Quinn, so could you review for us, I'm not suggesting we do it, but for example, the school and projects carryover, department needs carryover, or are there other areas where theoretically one might look if one wanted to find some money that perhaps was not legally committed to?
I do think we will have a better picture once we're a few months into the year to see where our salary file is. So what typically happens is during the mid-year budget review, any savings that we may have from the first few months of operations, you're going to see those savings reflected in the mid-year budget review that we can set aside for the 2016 beginning balance. So we can start to look at the various different major accounts to see if there are any additional savings we may be able to realize. But since the year is just starting out, it's difficult to say what that amount might be. But I think during the mid-year budget review, we'll have hopefully some audit adjustments that could go in our favor as well. So some of those funds could be set aside for the beginning balance for 2016. Now, as for some of the other carryover, obviously the schools carryover is a policy and practice that we have in place, and those funds are being carried over for our schools. And a lot of the projects, those funds are pretty well committed as well, because we got to finish up and complete the implementation of some of our major projects. So that wouldn't be the first place that I might go and look at, but I think we can maybe start monitoring some of the accounts more closely as we approach the mid-year budget review.
If I might add to that, as soon as chairs are appointed by the chair of all of our committees, once we have a budget chair and vice chair, we'll be sitting down again and starting the process all over again. And I think everything's back on the table, Ms. Reed. I think we do have to look right now. What's presented to you assumes no additional funding from the Board of Supervisors right now. But we know that this past year was just the start, that we weren't done yet. We still have some daunting challenges ahead. These are committed in terms of undelivered orders and carryover and that kind of thing for this year. But I think it's back on the table. I think we have to study it. We have to look at which schools, are keeping or maintaining the 25%. How does that look over time? And I know it's kind of a catch-22, so we have to find that balance, because if you don't allow carryover, then the tendency is to expend monies all the way down to the last penny. So, but I still think it's worthy of, let's look at it, because you're right. Those are not necessarily budget monies. Let's see how they're being spent.
And if I could follow up, can we get a little more explanation or a breakdown of those, in particular, those three items? We had talked about that, the undelivered orders, $34 million. The school and project carryover, $17 million. Department critical needs carryover, $4 million. Just one. I'm sure you have it someplace where it's just a description of what those items are. I think it would be illuminating for the board to see the kinds of things that are being planned. So I would think, is that possible to do for us? Okay, so that would be an action item that I would suggest. Thank you. And I do understand the current practice, and I'm not suggesting pulling the rug out from under anybody, but at the same time, I do think that we have to, take a fresh look at all of our expenditures and really start to put those through the lens of, is this really critical at this time? So, thank you.
Okay, before I go on to anyone else, Mrs. Reed, I just want to confirm the action item is to request from the budget staff a breakdown of the commitments and carryover item, correct? Do we have that, Madam Clerk? Okay, all right. Very good. I believe I have Mrs. Strauss next.
On E, It's on page 4, the retiree healthcare credit and state group life, which is a state. We have a savings or a reduction in, okay. Is that truly a reduction, or did the state do that in order to balance their budget? Are we going to come back and find that that's been increased again? What was the genesis of that? Or were they
I
just
think with-
trying to balance their budget and decided
I
we're
think
all going
with
to underfund
any
this?
rates, it's based on all the actuarial assumptions. So they did have a slight change in the rate for next fiscal year. So is that permanent? I mean, I think if your experience stays the same without any changes in those assumptions, the rates probably won't change. But just like with the retirement rates, with any other rates, because it's based on experience, those rates could go up or they could go down.
So this really was actuarial. It wasn't just, gee, we've got to balance the budget, and so we're all going to underfund
I believe so.
this.
We could look at the details
'Cause I'm always
and get back to
suspicious.
you. But when they released the budget, those were the rates that they
they
provided
stated.
to the localities.
And next year is the first year of a new biennium.
15, yes.
Yes. And so then the question is whether or not we will have a chance at all of getting a better shot with the state, but that's obviously a concern for next year. That has nothing to do with this.
Yeah, so 15 and 16 rates are pretty much set.
Okay.
So when you said next year, it threw me a little bit. So
Right.
this year, 15, we're in fiscal year 15 now. I know we're doing 14 actuals, but 15 rates and 16 rates are going to be pretty much set. It's the next biennium,
Right.
which would be FY 17,
Right.
when the rates would be updated.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Strasser, I just want to make sure I've got this. So you are asking for more information about the...
No, I think that's.
You're satisfied?
Yeah, I'm satisfied. There's no
Okay,
sense. I
no
just
action item. All
wasn't
right.
real sure of what else was going on.
Anyone else have comments, questions, possible amendments they may wish to raise? Ms. McLaughlin?
Okay,
Ms.
I had one more on the joint BOS School Board synthetic turf initiative. It seems to me that we heard that, obviously, this is an amount that goes forward for next year, but then there's been some proffer money, so that the assumption is that there will be less money that we're going to have to put into this in the next 2 years, but that this is the amount we have to put in now.
That's correct. We need $1.5 million for 2015.
Right.
And because of the additional proffer funding that we have received so far, we believe we are not going to be required for the third and the fourth installment of the $1.5 million. What we're hearing from the county is that the next installment will be less than $500,000 from each organization. And I believe there was a question from Ms. Schultz on the schools that were on the queue for the turf replacement, and we did receive some information from facilities. So this summer, we will have Mount Vernon and West Potomac completed. Edison was already done. And then in the queue is Hayfield and Annandale for 2015. And then we initially had Stewart and South County for 2016, but we believe we're going to be able to accelerate that, because if the funding is available and the communities have been able to raise their portion of the share, then we believe we could accelerate Stewart and South County as well. And then the last school, Thomas Jefferson, that is really dependent on the renovation schedule, so we're still evaluating the implementation for Thomas Jefferson.
There's a slight correction. Edison has one field, but they do
They're
not have a
working on
second
that
field,
second
so I don't know
one,
where
yes.
that stands. Okay.
Okay, and Ms. Schultz has a clarifying question.
Okay, so I just have a clarifying question, because that was a run-through, but Mount Vernon and West Potomac are already finished?
This summer, this year.
So that's not the 1.5 million?
No, that was last year's 1.5.
Okay, so the 1.5 million is really Hayfield and Annandale?
Yes.
And one more?
Hayfield and Annandale. Our share is $750,000 each, so 1.5 really gets
Okay.
us 2 schools. But because we had some additional funding from the proffer funds, we think we could accelerate the next 2 schools,
Okay.
Stewart and South County.
Okay, so I just think that those are important talking points for us to know, is that when we're talking about it, it's Hayfield, Annandale, Stewart, and South County that are impacted by us being able to do this when the Board of Supervisors does theirs. Okay, that answers the question. Thanks.
Okay, folks, no pressure, but, if we finish in 5 minutes, we'll be on time. So I have Ms. McLaughlin, then Ms. Evans, and then looks like Ms. Darnett Koufax.
So first of all, I support Ms. Reed's request that we get a little more details about the commitments and carryover expenses. I think because one of the things we always hear is we're like 88% compensation driven, and then what people don't realize is 12% of $2.6 billion is still a lot of dollars. And so I think it will just help us to understand, especially for the public and the board of supervisors who see dollars like that and say, what on earth, if you've got 55 million and, what's that going toward? So that was the first thing I wanted to pose my support for. The second thing is that I can't help but be mindful about the fact that we are looking at trying to address the start time issue. And when I look at the chart, it was on page 7 with the blue chart. And you look at it and it says step increases for FY 2016, and it gives the $40 million amount, and then the market scale adjustment of 1%, the $19.2 million, and then you see equipment and infrastructure, program needs, and blueprint for change with question marks. One of the things I wanted my colleagues to either weigh in on or think about is, we know this blueprint for change, we're looking at something in the ballpark of around $5 million. And rather than just take that chunk of 23 million or whatever it is and carry it over to the FY 2016, if I read your documents right, that here in my mind, we've listed those out as almost like the placeholder. This is what we're kind of thinking about for our budget goals. And, rather than take that 23, maybe it's not going to be 23, it's going to be 18, because we're going to plug in 5 there and say that it's not carryover funds, it's what we are building in automatically as a budget commitment. So I was kind of wondering a little bit if maybe Dr. Garza would want to weigh in on that one, but to me, it's trying to really demonstrate to the public and to each other that we're serious. And so,
well, and I think we listed there for a reason, the blueprint for change, because we knew that was coming up. But in terms of what that dollar amount is, we're still uncertain about the exact dollar amount, but I think certainty is ahead in terms of some board action potentially at the end of October. Keep in mind, if a board approves a plan in October, that would be built into the fiscal year 16 budget.
And this chart actually shows you the preliminary picture of that 2016. So, right? FY
2016, yes,
right.
Which is what the blueprint for change is going to be, FY 2016.
So we could go in and saying, yes, that we think there may be a placeholder of anywhere between 5 to 10. I think initially when we did this chart back in May, we didn't know where we might end up. I think after today's presentations, we're closer to where we think we might end up. So you could add $5 million on this chart. That would just take your bottom line deficit from 58.3 to 63.3 if you added $5 million. So, and we're going to also give you a fiscal forecast in September that will probably have a dollar value for that particular line item in the fiscal forecast.
And here's where the challenge, I feel like we find ourselves each year. So that projected shortfall, we hear it every year. And then here we are in July, and we're saying, oh, we got about 23 million we're going to carry over to FY 2016 as part of our beginning balance. And so I just,
This deficit does include using that $23 million in 2016.
I understand, but every year, our carryover includes the fact that we had a beginning balance and we still have a projected deficit. Like, this projected shortfall is not new. It's been going on since, what, at least the recession?
But it's getting larger, the projected deficit, because we've,
Yeah. And you have to remember, we've already accounted for 3% of the county's transfer increase in this number as well.
I know, I'm just making an observation that what we still get the pushback from the Board of Supervisors and the public is they say, you all projected this deficit,
Yep.
we didn't give you the money, and you still ended up with, carryover balance. Now,
Yep.
I hear what Dr.
I'm-
Garza is saying, that it's shrinking.
And I think I'm going to go back to, I understand where you're going with this or what you're asking, and if you have to remember, every year, we are going to have an ending balance. I could guarantee you that.
Oh, I completely
Right?
agree.
So that ending balance is the carryover, is what's available to be used as beginning balance for next year. Because, as we budget, I think I've mentioned this before, we are very conservative on our revenue side and conservative on our expenditure side. We do anticipate this ending balance in a downward trend for the next few years. Because I think during the recession, we've all been, we've heard from the community and everybody about having an ending balance that's typically between $40 to $50 million. And as we built the 14 budget, we knew we weren't going to have the $40 million in ending balance because we built the budget differently. We used different projections for the vacant positions. We increased our salary lapse. So in 2014, we knew this number is going to be significantly less than last year's number. Last year at this time, we had approximately $45 million. This year, we have $23 million. And then we anticipate in 2015, that number to be lower than where we are today.
so essentially, it's about 1% of our budget, is that correct? Yes. Yeah, it's 1% of our budget, which is a scary thing in my mind.
True.
Now, the difference between what the county has, they have a year-end balance too, and it's usually higher than ours, even though their budget's smaller. But they have the luxury of spending, they could spend all of that year-end balance that they want to because they don't have a structural deficit. So they can spend it all on one-time needs, whatever they want to buy, computers for all their employees. We've not in a position to have that kind of luxury. We always have to budget it toward the next year, which is a problem.
But I do want to point out for my colleagues, I don't know if they noticed this as I did, but if you look at item C, the elementary school full-day Mondays, you look at the D, bus purchases, look at H, the flexibility reserve, and then you look at B on the next page, major maintenance, you add up all those numbers along with the 23 million, and you're at $44.5 million. Like if we weren't doing full-day Mondays, and if we chose to not do bus purchases, and we chose not to do the major maintenance, I mean, in other words, we are still, at the end of this year, we are pulling out, the 21 million, and deciding to do something else with it. So
we anticipated, if you go back to the chart on page 7, back in May, we anticipated that we would have about $30 million. You are correct. We were anticipating 30, but because of full-day Mondays, we're down to about 23. Now, for the $8 million of flexibility reserve, that is one-time savings that you have in your budget. We do not include that in our baseline. So when we're building the budget for next year, we don't take into account that $8 million unless you want to spend it just one time to help with your beginning balance. So that's like a savings account that flows through your accounts. So at the end of every year, if your policy is to maintain that $8 million flexibility reserve, you're always going to have that $8 million available at the end of the fiscal year, which then gets carried over into the following year. But we do not build it every year into our baseline budget.
I'm just making the observation that if I were a member of the Board of Supervisors or someone who's been trying to understand when FCPS says, here's where we're going to find ourselves, we do need to be mindful that what we are demonstrating in these documents today is we are electively spending about $24 million and then putting the other, or $21 million, we're electively spending $21 million and putting the other 23 into the beginning balance. Between the major maintenance, the bus purchase, the full-day Mondays, and the flexibility reserve.
You are correct.
People need to look at
And
those
I
numbers
think-
and realize
yeah.
we're going to be questioned on those.
But I think with major maintenance, we have to remember 2 years ago, we took that out of the baseline budget. So we are not only significantly behind, we made it worse when we adopted the 2014 budget. We removed it. We cut major maintenance, and we said at the end of the year, if there were funds available, we would put toward major maintenance. And I think with the bus purchase, we were recommending that it might help with our later start times. So hence, we have some savings from our transportation accounts. So we would have one-time bus purchases for next fiscal year.
No,
So
I'm
agree
not,
with you
yeah.
that we are spending the money, but we were very selective, I think, on what we were recommending to spend the money. So, but I agree with your observation that we are spending some of our year-end balance before, setting that full amount for 2016.
And I'm not planning on any amendments to changing it, but I think it's just important to really look at, these are significant, expenses that we as a board are going to own and be, paying for.
Okay, Ms. Evans.
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to agree about the blueprint for change. I mean, I can see when you developed this document, we had a range, but we didn't really have a number. And I think after today, we could legitimately put in there somewhere around 5 million because that's what we think it's going to be about that month. So I'll just mention that. On the, I appreciate folks who brought up the synthetic turf fields. I think Mrs. Strauss originally did. Accelerating Stewart and South County, does that mean to summer of 2015 or something else?
I believe that's what we're aiming for. We would have to get confirmation from facilities, because initially it was the summer of 2016.
Right.
But we believe it can be summer of 2015 as long as there's funding available from the community for their portion.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you. That's wonderful news. Thanks.
Okay, Mr. Koufax and then Mr. Moon.
I also had a question about the turf fields. I have and I want a clarification. Edison does have 2 turf fields, and we're done with that. The Hayfield is the one that has community money right now, but the install would be pushed back rather than a winter install to a spring for the following season. And I was wondering if we could possibly do a winter install at Hayfield High School next year, given our financial situation, to allow spring sports to be played on the turf field.
And again, I think we're going to have to follow up with facilities, but our understanding is that the winter installation
Is more. I know
is
that.
more expensive.
So it's budgeted based upon a
Summer
a spring install after sports season. Okay, just check for sure. I'm pretty sure I know the answer. But I'm just going to try anyway, because I know that's what the community wants, and try that. I guess I have a question, and I'm sorry I was engrossed in an email when Ms. Reed started her line of questioning, talking about the full-day Mondays and the reoccurring costs. And so we're okay right now with the fact that we have budgeted for the entire costs of full-day Mondays, because I certainly hear there are some rumblings from the Board of Supervisors based upon their last meeting that they were not amiable to even funding a portion of that.
That's correct, for 2015. So we're
Correct.
using one-time money to fully fund it for 2015.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Moon, please be patient. I see that, actually, I should record yours as a go-back, and you'll follow Mrs. Strauss.
You can take me off anyway.
Oh, okay. I think I had a question, but I'm going to defer to Mrs. Strauss.
Okay, I just had information on the Post-Employment Benefit Trust Fund, that's GASB 45 OPEB. Okay. What is our actual target amount that we have to eventually have in that fund? $439 billion.
It's pretty significant.
I know.
We are funding the actuarial rate, so we are funding what the actuaries are requiring us to fund.
Okay.
But what is our unfunded liability? I would probably have to get you that number. I think it's in hundreds of millions of
That's what I
dollars.
thought, yeah.
Because when it initially was implemented, we hadn't pre-funded any of the
Right.
benefits that were promised to the employees. And that is obviously assuming we don't change our retirees' subsidy benefit.
Okay, and so what we've got here satisfies the law
Yes.
in whatever is being required, and is there a deadline as to when we have to get to this hundreds of millions of dollars in the trust fund?
No, as long as we're using the acceptable actuarial valuations, it meets all the requirements and the reporting requirements. But there is a table in our financial statement reports
Okay,
about
I
the
can probably look at
unfunded
it.
liability portion of it and what percentage we are. I think you probably have heard in our retirements anywhere from 70 to 80% funded ratio is a pretty solid indicator.
Right, here,
Obviously,
I see it
OPEB
there.
is well below that.
Okay, and then, there was one other question on that. Okay, so we're following whatever anybody says we have to follow on that. Oh, is there, at one point under the law, the states, along with these kind of things, would have to declare their unfunded liability and whether or not that was going to affect bond rating, et cetera? Is that still a concern? Is that still going to happen, and will that have an impact?
It is still going to happen. I'm not sure how much of it is going to actually impact the bond rating. I think it probably take the same form of when we had to initially report the other post-employment benefits, because those liabilities were also very significant, and there was a lot of concern about the bond ratings for all the localities. With the change in the currently, it's just the pension liabilities, but ultimately, we will have to report the OPEB liabilities as well. Obviously, the concern is those liabilities now have to show on what we call the face of your financial statements.
Right,
That's the balance
exactly.
sheet. You have to show the liability right up front. But we have always included the liability in the notes. So this isn't something new to the
Okay.
bond rating agencies. The only new aspect of it is really the VRS liability.
Right.
We've
That was
never
the
had
issue.
to actually report the VRS liability on anybody's books other than the pension system. But because now we are participating employer of VRS, our portion of the liabilities will have to be reflected in our financial statements as well as the county's financial statements.
So is this a requirement that we fulfilled in this last year, or this will be new next year?
This 2014, the pension plans were required to implement. 2015 is the first year for the employer, so that would be the county and the school
Where it
system's
will
financial
actually
statements. So it'll be
Okay.
next year.
Thank you.
Ms. Hines.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to catch up on something Ms. Darnat Kofax said. I guess I was unaware. Have we found out now that the Board of Supervisors is not interested in funding our full-day Mondays?
I can briefly speak to that. This morning, I put a call into Mr. McKay after I was informed from one of my colleagues that she saw him at an event this weekend, and I have a link that I have not looked to. He sent me a link to their board meeting where there was some conversation, and the leanings of that particular board were not in favor of doing it at this time, and they don't vote on it until September, though.
I'm sorry, they don't vote on it until September?
Correct.
Okay. So I was just wondering if maybe we could all weigh in with our supervisors and say that that was part of our consideration in passing this, is that they offered, their chair
Absolutely
sat in
think
this
that would be
room
a
and offered
great
to help
idea.
us?
Oh, well, yes, and that was,
Wish we had opportunity to ask her this morning, I just didn't know.
I did ask her this morning as I walked her out, and she confirmed the same conversation that I had with Mr. McKay a few minutes earlier that morning.
Well, I would encourage any member of the public who wants full-day Mondays to help us with that. Go ahead and get on the phone with supervisors and let them know we were counting on it.
So when the supervisors bed to public pressure and allocate some more money for us, that would take effect as an amendment or as a quarterly review amendment, is that right?
Yes, and we would recognize it at mid-year. But I think the critical piece to all this is we do have 1 year funded 2015, right? So even if the action was not in our favor for their carryover, the critical piece is the recurring piece. Because we're going to have this cost every year going forward. So we would like them to have built this into their transfer increase request. So I believe that's the critical piece going forward.
Okay, is there anyone who hasn't spoken who wants to raise a question? Okay, I'm just going to raise one thing, which is regarding the cost of buses and the blueprint for change. It's my understanding, so we're going to purchase, we're choosing to purchase 20 new buses out of year-end money, okay? Now, if we were to retire only 5 buses, then we would have, let's say, a net gain of 15 buses. So that net gain of 15, for instance, would constitute essentially a down payment on the cost of the blueprint for change, so that the total bill actually would not wind up being 5.5 million, but something less than that. Is that correct?
Something less than that, correct.
Okay.
But it will not be by this whole amount, because you have to remember this was a full one-time purchase of buses. What was built into Blueprint for Change was lease payments of additional buses, which is, and bus, yeah. Mm-hmm. So it will be less, but it will not be by this full amount.
Right. Is there anything else? Mr. Moon.
Since we're talking about a Board of Supervisors support on our implementation is full day Monday, after the board meeting, after the last board meeting, I sent a letter over to, Chairman Bloba, and Chairman Bloba, upon receiving the letter, copy of which you have all received, but this email from, Chairman Bloba clearly indicated that she would be happy to support finding a way to assist during their carryover. I just wanted to convey that to you.
Okay, if there are no other comments or questions, then this budget work session is concluded. And we'll just have a brief break of a couple of minutes so that the folks can get the equipment ready, and we'll move on to the audit committee.